Hi, I'm Alan V. Harris, V for Vernon, and I am beginning on my YouTube channel an occasional, hopefully at least monthly, that's one of my resolutions for 2020, a video that will give a little bit of the background about me and my history. And so, not certain anybody will be terribly interested in that, but I thought that would be kind of a fun thing to do for posterity's sake. So these are completely unscripted, and we're just going to leave them with all the flaws and bumps that happen. So let's begin. So a little bit about my family history. So my mother is Sara Vernon Traffinstead Sizemore Harris, which means she was married twice. And my father was Wesley Dalton Harris. He also had been married before. My father's first marriage I know very little about, and to the best of my knowledge, he and his short-lived wife had, not short-lived, short-lived marriage to his wife, had no children. My mother, of course, was married to William J. Sizemore, and my older sister, Linda Gale, and brother, William John, were both children from that first marriage. So let's stick with my mom for a little bit. So my mother grew up in the South, was born in northern Alabama in DeKalb County. We were told she was born up in the holler. When I was a young child, we did go visit, and in fact, everything that you hear about a southern holler, meaning a valley in a very poor part of the countryside, was true. A very ramshackle house that many of my family members lived in, at least at that time, and no major cities or towns nearby. I think the closest city was Fort Payne, Alabama. So my mother was born to Dora Lee Traffinstead and Vernon Traffinstead. My mother, however, was born after her father's death. That makes her what's called a posthumous baby. As I understand it, my grandfather, Vernon Traffinstead, died of the influenza. And if you recall, my mom was born in 1919, and 1919 was the period of the great influenza epidemic, so that makes perfect sense. So she was born after her father died, and she did have some other siblings. I won't go into all that because I'm not sure of all the details, and I don't want to get them wrong. My mother and grandmother lived in Alabama, and then for quite a bit of time in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where my grandmother, Dora Lee, ran a boarding house, and my mother helped her with the boarding house. My mom ended up going to Newell School of Nursing in Chattanooga and became an RN, and her lifelong vocation was as a registered nurse. My father grew up in southeastern New Mexico, near Tatum, on a ranch that was run by the Harris family. My father's father was Robert Harris, and his mother was Blanche. And I don't have all the exact details, but what I do remember is that my grandfather died sometime after my father was born and was a young child, and his wife, my grandmother, Blanche, for some reason could not stay on the ranch, was unsettled by it, or was overwhelmed by it, or she met someone else. But anyway, she moved to Dallas, Texas, where she married a gentleman by the name of Mr. King and had a complete different life there. So my father stayed on the ranch and for all intents and purposes was adopted by his cousins, who then in my lifetime would be seen to me as aunts and uncles and first cousins, when in fact they were first cousins and second cousins. So my father was a rancher. My Aunt Viola, which would have been his aunt, when we would go out to the ranch many years later, mainly on Memorial Day, when the whole family would gather at the ranch house, have a big dinner, and then we would have a ceremony to remember and do wreath laying at both the family cemetery, which is on the ranch called Murphy's Chapel, and the nearby cemetery in Lovington. Rest Haven, I think. I need to check on that detail, where my father was buried, and later my mother and my grandmother. But anyway, my father, so he was adopted. The kind of grand patriarch was Harv and Naomi Harris. So I, for all intents and purposes, consider them kind of quasi-grandparents. Harv was Robert's brother. Just to put that into context. And then all of Harv's family and his children were the ones that were on or near the ranch and ran many of the ranch details. When I was a young child and we would go out for these Memorial Day visits, I do still remember there being cattle, although cattle were at some point exchanged for farm and farm crops. Because of the changes of the cattle industry and so forth. But when I was young, we would get on a horse. My Uncle Prentice, because the home was owned by Prentice and Norris after Harv died, he was the first person to get me on a horse and train me how to ride a horse around the ranch. We would go look at the cattle. I do remember there being some ramshackled shacks a ways away from the farmhouse, the ranch house, and Mexican migrant workers were there. And even as a young child, I remembered distinctly thinking how different the accommodations were for the family and for these very hardworking ranch hands. One of the stories I remember is my brother Pat and I, and who knows what other children, decided to play in the silo where the big grain was, and we were quickly scolded for the danger of being in a silo, and later years I would learn exactly how dangerous it is to be in a silo. But anyway, there would always be a huge feast. There was a children's table, or tables, because there's so many of us, a huge adult table, all the things, kind of a classic ranch family. And then we'd all get in cars, go over to the cemetery. My Aunt Viola would have loaded the back of her sedan with all kinds of plastic wreaths. And as she would walk around Murphy's Chapel, would lay the wreaths on each of the family members and tell the children stories about them. It was a marvelous way to learn your family history. Some of those markers were in wood and therefore had faded away, not because of rot as much as because of dry rot and the sand and the sun, because this is southeastern New Mexico, where it was very hot and sunny. Nothing on the cemetery that you would classically think of as cemetery. A few scrubby mescalero bushes, or mesquite bushes. Pine trees were eventually planted to try and give a little bit of shade, but really scrub and dust. Of course, they had moved to having granite gravestones, so those lasted the length of time. I remember when Uncle Prentice died. That was a major event, and he had the largest headstone up to that point there. But anyway, when the local pastor from the church, mostly Methodist, I think it was a Methodist pastor, would come up, and we would all gather by the entrance of Murphy's Chapel, and the pastor would pray with the family and pray for all those who had gone before us. And we would sing, and we would always sing, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." And to this day, when I sing that song, I think of family, I think of Memorial Day, I think of love, and I think of my Aunt Viola teaching us about the importance of all those things. So then my family would get in the car and go over to Lovington, and Aunt Viola would go with us because she was kind of like that, even though she was not quite as connected. But anyway, my father was buried at the cemetery in Lovington, and we would go and honor him. Aunt Viola would always tell the story of when my father died, that Pat, who was old enough to speak and to go with them to the funeral, walked over to the statue of Jesus that was positioned in just such a way as to look out over my father's grave, and apparently said to this statue, "Jesus, take care of my daddy." So that was always one of those stories that Aunt Viola made sure we knew. And then we would go home. My grandmother, Dora Lee Traffinstead, would eventually be buried in that cemetery, and then years later, my mom, Sara Vernon Harris. So just then a little bit about my birth, and then we'll call this one quits. So I was born January 30th, 1963. I happen to be videotaping this on January 30th, 2020. So it's my birthday. So I was born several months after my father died. So you recall there's kind of two families here. My older sister Linda and older brother Bill. Their father died in a World War II sabotage attack in India. He was a pilot of a transport plane. I don't know all the exact details, and some of the stories I've heard throughout my history have been maybe not as factual as I remember them, so I won't go into that. The thing to remember, however, is that my older sister was born and my brother Bill was in utero, was not yet born when his father died. So my brother Bill is a posthumous baby. If you're listening, you'll notice that this is the second posthumous baby. My mother was born after her father died of influenza, and my brother Bill was born after his father was killed in World War II in a sabotage attack in India. So my mother met my father. They became a family. They got married in 1952, about the time that my father was serving as an advisor in the Korean conflict. And I'm not 100% sure whether or not he adopted my brother and sister. They were teenagers by this point, but they did legally have their names changed from Sizemore to Harris. And my brother and sister saw my father very much as their father because, of course, they had grown up with him. So fast forward a little bit, and in 1959, they had my father and my mother had their first child together, and that was my brother Pat. He was born in April of 1959, and then my mother was pregnant with me. My father had decided to retire from the military. He had had a home built in Roswell, New Mexico. It was close enough to the ranch and to family that they could be connected, but not on top of each other. Plus, at that time, Roswell had an Air Force base called Walker Air Force Base. And my father thought that, of course, they would need the PX and the other benefits of having a U.S. military installation since he would be a veteran. So he was doing his end-of-duty paperwork and different kinds of processes, and he went down to the base at El Paso and had his exit physical, and in that physical they learned that he had cancer of the larynx, and it was fairly progressed, and of course at that time not as much treatments as we have today. So by I believe by September, my father died, and my mother then would give birth to me in January. So it was quite fascinating as a young person to go through my mother's memorabilia and have both the same note or the same card congratulate Sarah on the birth of her new son and offer their sympathy on the death of her husband. So a very painful mix. The final thing I'll tell is that the story my sister tells is that, and there are facts for this, I was just shy of 10 pounds. I was 24 inches, the longest baby ever born at St. Mary's Hospital in Roswell, New Mexico. I have a little card that verifies that I am the longest baby ever born there. Rumor has it I was breech, and rumor has it I was almost 10 months, that I was supposed to have been born in December. So anyway, I was born into a family that was in grief, but also in love with each other and with taking care of each other. So enough for now. So a little bit of story of Alan V. Harris, and the V stands for Vernon, from Roswell, New Mexico. Next time I'll tell you a little bit about my childhood and the weird and wonderful things that happened then. So thank you all for listening. God bless. Bye-bye.